Rob Atkinson, I'm president of ITIF. I want to welcome you to an event, discussion panel this morning on net neutrality, and in particular, I think 3 days have gone by in DC without a net neutrality event, so we felt that we had to do one. I think there'll probably be another one tomorrow. Obviously, a long-running topic in DC, and the subject of many, many words and lots of barrels of ink or keystrokes. But I think what we wanted to focus on was that in the last NPRM on net neutrality, that there seemed to be an interesting possible convergence of opinions, certainly not complete, but something where we thought there was a little bit more movement and perhaps, I guess we would call rationality in the debate than there might have been a year ago. And so we wanted to have a panel of some of the folks who made interesting comments, as well as one person who received them. So what we'll do today is just a very each of the panelists will make about just 5 minutes of remarks talking about what they found interesting or perhaps surprising about some of the filings. We'll have a little bit of dialogue, and we should have at least 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. I'm not going to give very long introductions to anybody. Richard Bennett is a research fellow at ITIF, and he has a background, a long background, 30-year background in network engineering. Link Hoeing, most of you know, is Vice President of Internet and Technology Policy at Verizon. Going in order here, Rick Witt is, you are Washington Telecom and Media Counsel for Google. And Julius Knapp is the chief of the FCC's Office of Engineering and Technology, which is the Commission's primary resource for engineering expertise. And in that capacity, he provides technical support to Chairman Janikowski, the commissioners, and FCC bureaus and offices. And he's been at the FCC for 33 years. And Morgan Reed is executive director of ACT, which is Association for Competitive Technology, and he focuses on a wide variety of technology issues there. And finally, Paul Meisner is going to be joining us. He has experiencing network congestion on Route 66. He's vice president of global public policy for Amazon. So with that, Richard, you want to? We're limited on mics, so if we can move the mics just back and forth and take turns with them, that'd be great. And make sure you speak early into them. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out to our sunrise service this morning. I think probably a good way to open this up is kind of take a look back at the history just very briefly. When the network neutrality, what we call open internet, which we used to call network neutrality, which before that we used to call end-to-end principles, that debate started about 10 years ago, and one of the things that actually made it happen was when policy people discovered the notion of the end-to-end principle in the design of the internet, which is something that was committed to paper by three folks at MIT, David Clark, David Reed, and Jerry Salzer in 1981 or so. And one of the remarks that was filed in this recent round of comments on the open internet NPRM that most surprised me came from the MIT folks, David Clark and then two other people that he's working with now, Bill Lair and Steve Bauer. So Clark was interviewed recently by the Pew Future of the Internet Project. They talked to a lot of thought leaders about where they thought the internet was going. And the question they put to him was, they asked him to agree or disagree with this statement, which, bear with me, I want to read it to you. The statement is, the future will produce a hybrid environment with a bit more control exercised in the core of the internet for some purposes, but for other purposes will enable end-to-end practices. Some things will have to be managed, especially if the capacity of the current internet becomes strained. And so this question really does kind of capsulize the 2 points of view on network neutrality. Does all the intelligence in the network need to be in the endpoint with a stupid core, or are there functions that require intelligence in the core of the network to be done efficiently. And Clark's answer is, I think we will have an outcome that's a hybrid of the two options. That for many users, the end-to-end principle in its literal form is a pain. He didn't say in which part of the anatomy, as we can imagine. It means you have to install software and manage upgrades on a PC that is complex and insecure. Much better to take advantage of services that are professionally run, and I think end users will be able to maintain and reach the content of their choice, use the applications of their choice. But so the crucial question is not where a function is located, whether it's at the endpoint or done by a service provider. Crucial question is one about trust, not about location. And to me, when the guy who came up with the idea that policy people turned into the requirement for end-to-end for network neutrality regulations makes a statement like that, it tells us that I think, have reached a different stage in the debate after all these years than what we've been at.
Great, thank you, Richard. Link?
Morning. I did look at a lot of the filings in the, not all of them, but a lot of them in preparing for this, and also over the last few weeks reading through them. One of the central points in the net neutrality debate and in the filings is the question of openness. And on that question, I think there's virtually no one that I could see in the filings who's contending there's a problem right now with respect to openness. Instead, the debate is over whether or not actions taken by the government would prevent a problem in the future, or whether actions taken by the government would cause a problem in the future. Let me provide some statistics from Verizon to kind of set the stage here in terms of our network, because I think it gives you a flavor for why I think the openness issue really isn't a problem at this stage. Every day, more than 100 million people connect using a Verizon network. About 2 billion text messages are sent each day, back and forth. 50 million video pictures are exchanged. 400 million emails are received. 8.7 petabytes of video are sent back and forth. That's millions of movies. Many millions of potential threats are monitored and acted on, and a billion phone calls, yes, we still do phone calls on these networks, are connected. So the reality is the networks work pretty flawlessly, I think, and in most instances, people get their communications delivered the way they want them to. The data flows back and forth seamlessly, and from my standpoint, there's no problem with connectivity or openness on these networks. The findings made so far in the FCC's NPRM on net neutrality, I think, reinforce these facts. Ignoring the filings that make a simple declarative statement about opposing or supporting net neutrality, if you look at the filings that go into some detail about policy, technology issues, or market issues, you get a sense of those who support regulations, those who oppose them, and those with unclear positions. To my way of thinking and looking at that as a standard, there are about 459 filings in these categories. From what I can tell, my analysis is that about 74% of them say no regulation should be imposed, or it should not be a priority, that other issues are more important. About 65 of them, or about 14%, say yes, we should have regulations, and about 54, about 12% are unclear. So even if I'm off a bit, the numbers suggest that most see no need for regulation. Now that said, even in many of the filings saying no regulation is important, many suggest that the FCC's broadband principles are important, and they're a good guide, and some enforcement to protect against bad actors is important. And I think there's a consensus on a lot of those filings. So on the question of what is the correct public policy for the internet ecosystem, it seems to me there's a growing amount of agreement from some of these filings. There is a sense, I think, among all the players that it's in the interest of the continuing health and growth of the internet to have some government oversight to deal with bad actors in the internet space. How that should be done, what the authority of the regulatory commissions are, is not clear in all of the filings, but that's a central point. I think most agree, too, that the internet's core strengths, user control and empowerment and self-governance, are important to maintain. Therefore, there's widespread support for increased transparency, so consumers and users are well informed. And I think this means transparency at all levels, networks, applications, and services, on how the applications work, how the broadband networks, what the speeds are, those kinds of issues. Second, there's growing agreement that there should be an emphasis on a robust self-governance process because of the rapidly evolving nature of the internet ecosystem. Looking at many of the findings, there's a strong belief that the internet's ability to innovate and evolve has been critical, and regulations could well lock in outdated approaches and or frustrate the innovation process. Third, there's a sense that government intervention should be limited. But I think there's also agreement on a test for government intervention when that's necessary. That test being A, consumer or user harm, or B, anti-competitive activity. In this sense, there's growing agreement about what a policy framework should look like in terms of enforcement. And finally, I think there's an acknowledgement in many of the filings that the Commission's policies should not create disincentives or to continued investment and innovation in all aspects of the internet, and that includes the networks, not just the applications and the services that ride on it. Innovation happens, in my view, on the internet because it allows for flexible approaches, collaboration, and competition all at the same time. Flexibility is not a hallmark of traditional anticipatory government regulation, so I think that's why people are making these points. Now, Verizon and Google worked for a long time trying to come up with some ideas of our own in terms of what areas we could agree on. And a lot of these points, I think, are reflected in the filing we made, which I hope some of you read. We spent a lot of time looking, for example, at how to create an industry technical advisory group, or TAG is what we called it, run by a diverse set of technology and engineering experts from across the internet ecosystem. Our feeling is that a great many of the changes of challenges facing us in the evolution of the internet are either technical in nature or technological in origin. And the TAG would provide ongoing advice to government policymakers. It would actively examine and research technology issues as they emerge. It would serve as a place to discuss technology challenges and where friction points and help establish norms for the industry. And finally, it could serve as a place to resolve industry disputes. We acknowledge in the filing at the same time that there's an ongoing place for government oversight on a case-by-case basis, although if you look at how we frame that, clearly we don't agree on exactly what that jurisdiction is. We also express the view that there can be benefits to the offering of enhanced services of various kinds, but at the same time, providers could take actions or adopt strategies that have negative impacts. And so we did come up with a standard, and I already referenced what that is, that it should, any action should not harm users or competition. And if it does do that, it should be deemed unacceptable. And finally, we acknowledged and supported the need for more transparency and more information on how broadband connections work, internet applications work, and internet services work, so that consumers understand what they're getting, and so frankly, all the players can work back and forth more effectively. The more we understand about how the internet's working, how the services are working, the applications are working, and the more consumers understand, the more empowered they are, the more competition we're going to get, and the better the internet will work. So we did not agree on everything, of course, particularly with regard to whether wireless should be covered by any net neutrality policies. We also believe that the entire internet ecosystem, at least in our view, should be covered by these policies, not just the networks. And that's an area of disagreement, I think it's fair to say. But on the whole, I think we agreed on quite a bit. And what we try to do is lay out some of those areas of agreement as a model for people to begin to talk about where we can come together on some of these policies. In our view, the internet has thrived under a bipartisan policy of limited government intervention maintained over many administrations. The burden, in our view, is on those who wish to radically transform this policy and impose new regulations on the internet. We believe the consensus is developing around some of the key points that I just referenced. And we hope the joint filing we offered actually offers some ideas on what those areas of agreement are.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Rick? Like you want to...
Thanks, Rob, and good morning, everybody. When I was in the second grade, our elementary school sponsored a science fair. One of my best friends brought in a large glass jar filled with leaves and twigs on mud and a few bored-looking insects, which she proclaimed was a terrarium, as you know, a small-scale, self-enclosed natural environment. Of course, when she forgot to include some water and to punch some air holes in the lid, the terrarium quickly turned into a miniature mausoleum. I was reminded of that glass jar recently as our broadband provider friends have begun to take up the meme of the internet as an ecosystem. Verizon in particular, and Link has mentioned a number of times this morning, have been employing that concept in their filings at the FCC and in some blog postings online. These include some relatively benign statements like all players, big and small, play vital roles, all parts are interrelated in ways not always obvious but always important, and value the trees but see the forest, which sounds more like a Zen saying than a policy view. However, Link and his folks have made a few other observations I want to touch on briefly this morning. First, they say that one should not try to classify and treat differently the entities in an ecosystem, as, quote, distinctions among these categories rapidly erode and lose their meaning. The FCC should not create artificial regulatory silos of devices, applications, content, and networks. In fact, quote, attempting to treat some parts different than others is a recipe for disaster for the whole. A second set of observations, roughly speaking, go around the notion of the internet ecosystem as being very robust and self-preserving without the need for external regulation. Now, on the surface, this ecosystem analogy does have some appeal, and in fact does generally track some cutting-edge theories about economic systems as modeled on biological systems. However, there are some important ways the analogy breaks down at least two of the lessons that Verizon has drawn. I want to talk about those again briefly this morning. First, treating some parts of an ecosystem different from other parts is not a recipe for disaster, it's plain common sense. One of the main characteristics of an ecosystem is its rich diversity, from flora to fauna, from carnivores to vegetarians. In the context of the internet, there is also admirable diversity between network providers and content providers, those who employ atoms and those who employ bits, as embodied in corporations of all shapes and sizes, entrepreneurs, individual users, nonprofit groups, and of course the government. However, while each entity occupies a niche in the ecosystem, no two niches are the same, and not all players play vital roles. Some are more vital than others. In fact, operating as keystone species, as the term is used in biology, upon which many others depend. In fact, broadband, in my view, does serve a prime keystone role in the ecosystem. It is an essential input to all other species of communications, information, and entertainment. It is a scarce resource in an otherwise robust environment. And it serves a unique control function no other species can match. Staying with the metaphor for a moment, one can think of broadband as the soil or the water that nourishes the rest of the internet quote-unquote ecosystem. Now, analogies and metaphors can only take us so far. To better understand the internet, I would prefer that we use a conceptual model that actually tracks the realities of technology and market structures, namely the layered nature of the internet. Under this model, entities are classified based on what functions they perform in the network, whether at the physical layer, the ISP layer, applications layer, or the content layer. Simply put, you are what you do. Thus, for example, even though the physical layers are vital to the activity of those in the upper applications and content layers, that does not amount to an equivalence in terms of the respective roles played in the marketplace. Indeed, the physical layers support all the activities that ride on top of, metaphorically, the world of the internet. Now, obviously, a good ecologist would view and treat different parts of an ecosystem in disparate ways depending on those very functional distinctions. Similarly, just because Verizon also provides online applications doesn't change the nature of its networking business. And just because Google intends to pursue a broadband testbed doesn't mean it should no longer also be seen as a software applications company. It's just a fact that broadband networks are not wireless app stores or search engines or an online social community. Each function needs to be understood in terms of the larger whole, but the whole does not consequently swallow up salient characteristics between the parts. Second, I also take issue with the suggestion that economic systems are inherently self-regulating, with little to no need for any outside influence. This sounds to me like a modern version of Adam Smith's famous invisible hand of the market. As the global financial disasters of the last several years have amply demonstrated, however, the more extreme version of this image is simply not true. No economic system is completely self-regulating. We need human-made institutions, laws, regulations, standards, norms to make economic systems function properly. Without the fundamental trust and equity brought about by property laws, contract laws, labor laws, consumer safeguards, the free market cannot hope to survive. The internet is no different. While still a marvel of self-regulation on many fronts, obviously the net is not a government regulation-free zone. Activities that are unlawful in the offline world are just as unlawful online. And consumers still need to be protected in their daily commercial transactions, whether someone steals their credit card at a grocery store or misappropriates it during an online sale. The right question to ask is not whether any governing institutions are necessary, but what kind: government, industry, or something else, and in what way. We believe as a general matter that the Internet of Bits is more robustly competitive and open to dynamic feature competition than the broadband infrastructure of atoms. That's simply our view. As a result, the latter market requires more concerted government attention than the former. Nonetheless, the Federal Trade Commission, not the Federal Communications Commission, has assumed the role of cop on the beat in the online commerce world in areas like online advertising and privacy, and it's a role that we at least accept. To Verizon's credit, they recognize the need for appropriate safeguards against bad acts by broadband providers that harm users. However, at the same time, and as the letter that was just published last evening at the FCC reveals, the broadband providers resist the FCC's authority, whether under Title I or Title II or anything else, to oversee the bad acts and bad actors in their sector. So in the FCC's proceeding, Google has taken the position that the federal government needs to establish tailored rules of the road to govern certain market practices by broadband companies. Verizon and others do not agree, and that's a worthy debate for us to have. But I think it does behoove all of us to have that debate on a record of empirical facts and economic analysis, and not premised on an otherwise useful metaphor stretched too thin and too far. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Rick. Judith, I'm going to skip you and have you back clean up.
That was easy.
Thank you for those helpful comments. So why don't we, Morgan, why don't we go next? I'll let Paul still catch his breath from recovering from traffic management problem.
Well, after hearing legal theories and ecology theories, biology, and a huge amount of of empirical data from both folks. I'm going to try to keep it really simple. Essentially, what I found interesting about both the filings and the NPRM was that there are 4 real characteristics I noticed. The NPRM starts out with kind of a fear-based proposition. It says, bad things could happen, so what do we need to do to prevent those from happening? From the developer community, we obviously are understanding that we don't want to get smacked around by the big players, but we would almost rather err on the side of freedom rather than restriction in this case, because oftentimes we need freemium products. We need to be able to provide a product that's free and then has a quality of service advantage to move it into the next category. Maybe I want to add extra content, other applications, new features. So we definitely see an advantage to having the opportunity to have some flexibility in our business models. But I think the heart of the matter on what the NPRM and the filings that I saw really revolved around the concept of the exemptions. Well, you know the old axiom that the exemption proves the rule. I think in this case I'd say the exemptions prove the rule, and the rules are, simply put, what we all know. Innovation is a function of flexibility and experimentation, that networks require management, and that investment requires a return on investment. So when we look at the discussion that we've just heard, I think it's important that we look at the way that the NPRM looks at the exemptions. It goes through and defines all of these things that we need to prevent, and then it gets to the point and it says, oops, we forgot all these great possible things that we want to encourage. Telemedicine, better video capabilities. There's this whole collection of ideas that we haven't even begun to mine that we need to promote. So I think we need to look at the exceptions and say, wait a minute, what are we really trying to achieve here? And let's flip this on its head. And I think the one thing that really does concern all of us is that this document produces a lot of red tape for the smaller folks. Really, one of the biggest issues we see is this declaratory ruling concept. Now, this may be unfair to the mandarins here in the audience, but a lot of small businesses are concerned about the concept of having to go and kiss the ring at the FCC in order to get their new business model approved or their concept approved. And while it may turn out that there are solutions to this problem, that's certainly an area that this declaratory ruling causes a lot of concern. I think we have to look at the ecosystem as it moves forward and see what we've already produced. We've talked a lot about things that things could go wrong, the loss of oxygen in our terrarium, the loss of water. But I'd also look at the way that we've been successful. We were all very afraid that the cable companies would squash any competition and that we wouldn't be able to get our movies when we wanted them. Well, I don't know if any of you have tried, there's a new service called HBO Go, which is pretty cool. You open up your laptop, if you've got a Comcast subscription, you can watch your HBO shows on your laptop. Not necessarily connected to your Comcast cable, not necessarily even in your home market, but you can watch your HBO shows. It's pretty cool technology. From the smaller perspective, we've got folks like Ustream and Ring Central PBX. These are smaller companies trying to make their mark on the larger stage. They're going to need the advantages that come from some of the quality of service opportunities that they see. And I think that we all need to look back and say, what are we trying to achieve here through this net neutrality, open internet coalition? We're trying to actually foster innovation. And as we said, the keys to fostering innovation are pretty simple. We need to push flexibility, experimentation, make sure that the network management provides the areas for expansion, and then investment, we've got to be able to let us get a return on our investment. So I think when we look at the overall pictures, we've heard the battling statistics go through, we need to really bubble this up into how do we get paid and how do we create new ideas.
Great, thanks. I know folks in the back there are some seats up here if you want to just take a minute and come on up, you're welcome to. Paul.
Thanks very much. And again, I apologize for being late. A fair amount of network congestion there. So far, what I've briefly heard here, I agree with both of you, both Rick and Morgan. And so I think I'd like to start out with just a brief example. Say you're a Mets fan and you live in Oklahoma, and you've got a really cool website that you've got up that has a lot of cool content on it that you want to make available to other Mets fans. But you come to recognize that most of your audience is in New York City, not in Oklahoma, and they're not being very well served by your location there in Oklahoma. There's a lot of latency. The traffic isn't being managed well between your servers and your customer base. So there are a couple things you can do. First of all, you could move to Hoboken. All or part of your operations could be relocated there, and the geographic proximity to New York will allow your customers to have better service from your servers. Sorry. Thank you. And did you miss everything I said before? Because some of you were nodding. We all got
I heard it fine.
What? People watching on the internet listening.
I see. Okay. Well, I apologize for that too. So you can move to Hoboken and you can give your customers a better experience. Similarly, you could hire out to an edge caching firm that has a server farm outside of New York. What they would do is simply take your content, cache it locally, and serve it locally, and again, give your customers in New York City a better experience. Third, you could go to any number of network providers and lease a private line, wherein you would actually have your content directed over a private line with no capacity or congestion issues all the way to the New York City area, and then injected into the local internet there. All three of these options are available to you today. Every single one of them is, and there are no complaints that any of them violate net neutrality principles, right? You don't say any of those things do. You can move or get edge caching or a private line, no complaints. Well, why? You're giving your customers in New York City a better experience than your neighbor who also has a website in Oklahoma. You're giving him a better experience than the guy who doesn't move or get edge caching or private line. Well, the reason why is by either moving or edge caching or getting a private line around the core of the internet, you have not done anything to degrade the other traffic in the internet. There's nothing you've done to hurt your neighbor's traffic, even though you've provided a better service for your customers. Well, I think that's the premise around which we ought to build a compromise on net neutrality. We ought to allow some new business models out there. We ought to allow some ways to improve services to content providers who pay. Because by the way, you have paid to move, or you've paid for edge caching, or you've paid for a private line. It's not free. So there may be other ways, perhaps in the core of the network, to also provide those kinds of enhancements. You can imagine some sort of favoring of some content over others based on other content based on a paid service. So long as there's no harm to any other content in the network. That's the core here. These available services today, these available solutions, and possible new solutions tomorrow, new business models, new revenue streams to the network operators and such, seem to me perfectly appropriate so long as there's no harm done to the other traffic in the network. And that was the core of our filing to the Commission a few weeks back. So just quickly on the Commission's proposed rules, I think the Commission did a good job of a sort of a first started rules. I like the brevity, which is welcome. But I think it could be improved. The proposed rules could be improved. Right now, when you look at reasonable network management as proposed in the Commission's rules, you read what you want to read. If you want to read just good housekeeping, you're just managing the network, doing nice things about sort of dealing with the congestion problems or spam or illegal content, whatever. You read it that way. If you're looking to get involved in new business models, new revenue streams, you can read it that way. In fact, there's sort of a very broad definitional problem where it says reasonable network management includes reasonable network management. So to my way of thinking, that's too loose. We ought to give clear rules of the road here. It seems to me that reasonable network management should be very limited, very specific to non-commercial services that you're not getting paid specifically to do. You're just managing your network. That's great. That's fine. I think everybody agrees that that's okay. But you should add another section, it seems to me, the FCC should, to be explicit about what kinds of new business models the network operators can be involved in. And it seems to me those new business models ought to revolve around this no harm principle. That whatever you do and get paid for doing, you can't disfavor or somehow degrade the traffic of those who do not pay and who do not use these new services.
with that.
Great.
I want to interrupt really quick for those watching at home. Paul said brevity. This is Washington speak for brevity. It is very good, but those of you watching at home, it's not a 3-page paper. So,
Well, for those of you watching at home, you have to know that the rules are only 2 pages.
that's right.
Okay, so this is an explanation of the rules in the background.
Because they're so complicated, we need a lot of
That's right.
Julie, do you want to explain all of this to us? Mike.
I have no microphone.
There you go.
Stereo!
That's right. One will be
Here it's
sufficient.
loud. Loud and clear.
First of all, thank you for having me. I would agree with the proposition that I think there is growing consensus in the proceeding. Certainly, we don't have everybody agreeing on everything, but I think we're further along than where we started on the points where people do agree. We're kind of mid-round here. We've had the comments come in, and then we'll have the replies. I think there's still some pending requests to provide a little bit more time to provide replies. And it's been a pretty rich record. There are many comments that are short and make a point in support of the proposal. There are many that go into deeper substance, and our team really has been sorting through all of them. I'm going to focus more on the role that I'm playing in this and the people that I work with, which is really on the technical side. We created, as the chairman had said, he wanted this to be a process that was transparent and open and focused on the legal policy as well as the technical issues. I'm sure I'm leaving something out. So we had formed what we call the technical advisory process. It includes engineers from my office and the other bureaus and offices that are involved in the open internet proceeding across the commission. We had a workshop with leading industry experts really to lay a foundation of technical understanding for how the internet works and how traffic is managed and so forth. We did that in early December. We've also had ex-party meetings, both individually and with groups. We've brought in a number of the players who had different points of view, and it's somewhat unusual for us to do this. Ordinarily, what happens is everybody files their comments, and we have the dueling comment process, and you don't often get to just sit down around a table and have a discussion that bores down into, well, what did you mean by this, and does everybody understand what's going on in the network? What is it you're really concerned about, and so forth. And so we've had a couple of meetings with roughly a dozen or so people. We put a summary of the ex-party into the record so people know actually what's transpired. And we've got another meeting actually scheduled later this week. And to give you an idea of some of the things that we've talked about in those meetings, how the internet service providers deal with unwanted content, viruses and so forth. And I think there's general consensus that it is reasonable for the network operators to take steps to deal with those sorts of things. We talked about transparency, and I think there's a lot of support across the board for transparency, both to provide information to consumers so that they understand the service that they're getting and how those services are being managed, but also maybe at a more detailed level for people who develop apps to understand how they're going to be handled on the network. So, and I think we've already heard that there's support for that. We talked a bit about congestion, and I think congestion is one of the more difficult issues to get your arms around. There is not a lot of good, solid data about the extent to which congestion occurs and how often and how it's dealt with. We've had some general discussions about congestion happening more on the edges of the network, where we essentially have only one pipe, it's your last mile versus the core. So, I think that's an issue that there's still some interest in getting a better understanding of how that's managed. We've started to get into discussions about quality of service and how internet service is differentiated from managed service. I think that's another area where we're still boring down into the record and having discussions about how do you parse those two things. I think it's been a very constructive process thus far. All of the discussions I think have been constructive and people exchanging ideas, and I think that will continue as we develop the record. So I'm very optimistic that in the end we'll be able to come up with a set of rules that will balance the various concerns of the parties.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks. Well, let me try to take a crack at summing up here. That I think, I should add, by the way, if anybody's interested, Rick has written a very nice paper, I guess about a year ago, on complexity economics, I think is the title.
Emergence economics.
Emergence economics, and I think if you just go on Bing, you can probably find a copy.
It's number one on the bullet on Bing.
There it is, yeah. But I think there does seem to be some consensus, I think, around the general notions of that blocking and degrading for no real reason, like, for example, blocking illegal content. I think there's a general consensus that that's fine. Blocking non-illegal content is not. There seems to be general consensus around the principles of several, I think, of the respondents made it around that behaviors that are clearly anti-consumer or anti-competitive should be prohibited. There seems to be some general consensus around network management that I think is positive, because I think a year ago there was a lot less consensus that networks need to be managed. I think part of the question there really is, and I think Paul alluded to, I think the right framing is, can if you're doing network management that is a positive-sum game, that essentially makes something work better for some part of the network but doesn't hurt another part of the network, then that's probably inherently should be allowed, and other types of network management would be more questionable and would need to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I think two areas of that, I think, where we perhaps don't have as much consensus. One is on pricing, and the whole notion of is it acceptable to do two-sided pricing. There was a recent study by the Policy Integrity Institute at NYU that did a fairly complex and relatively sophisticated economic analysis of this, but I thought largely sophisticated economic analysis based on a fundamentally flawed premise, which was that there would be mandatory two-sided pricing, which I don't see in any part of the market ever developing mandatory two-sided pricing. I see it as voluntary two-sided pricing. So if an application provider, content provider wants to buy specialized service that's better than best efforts, I think there's still some debate about that point. And the second point I think there's obviously debate about, which we heard, was this whole question of what is the scope of this? Is it around the entire ecosystem, or is it around the internet, the network? And if it's around the network, do you have the same rules for wireless, or do you have the same for wireline? So let me just start by maybe just seeing if we can talk a little bit about the pricing issue. Sort of where do you all think there's consensus on the pricing issue, and perhaps where is there some disagreement? I don't know if anybody wants to jump in there.
Take first crack at it. So I think on the pricing issue, it is difficult, because there are certain things I believe we all agree on. One is that a sort of mandatory two-sided market is not acceptable, right? So a broadband provider decides they're going to establish some sort of terminating access charge arrangement that every applications and content provider has to pay into in order to have their traffic served to the end user customer. I think there's probably general agreement that that's wrong. You can't do that. Although we're hearing signs from folks like Telefonica over in Spain who think that's actually a great idea, which is one of the things I worry about, is this debate kind of evolves in other places, that some more extreme versions of these pricing arrangements could be deemed acceptable outside the U.S. Another one is exclusive arrangements, right? So I want to sign one deal with one entity, and that's it. Nobody else gets access to it. I think there's general consensus as well with that. Under any non-discrimination standard I can think of, that would be a problem. So I think it does come down to this notion of the so-called voluntary two-sided markets. And as we said in our comments, our concerns there are that, well, we actually listed 10 or 11 different concerns, but at the bottom, it comes down to a whole new system of charging that has never been on the internet before. We've always established a situation where the end user essentially pays for their broadband connection to get to the internet, and those of us in the content and applications world, we build our data centers, we link them up with billions of dollars worth of transmission lines that we acquire largely from the carriers to bring our content to the internet, and there's sort of a meeting in the middle, and that's kind of the end of it. Once you start setting up a situation where folks on the content and application side are paying it even on a voluntary basis, you've really radically altered the economics of the net in ways that I think are unfortunate, particularly for some of the smaller players out there, the entrepreneurs in the garage who have to figure out how many thousands of ILECs and cable companies I'm supposed to pay to get my stuff seen better than somebody else's stuff. Nonprofits, they have to start paying as well to get into this fast lane. So the transaction costs are, ramp up significantly. It also, frankly, reduces incentives to invest in the network, right? If you have two choices, either to put a box in your network that allows you to kind of monetize scarcity versus just building more network capacity, the easier thing to do is to help us put a box in the network. And that way, I can just slow my capacity growth, maximize the use of that capacity in ways that, in fact, the worse the capacity gets for the net side over time, the more it drives people to want to use my prioritized service. And it creates, I think, some negative incentives for investment in the infrastructure. So in our comments, we haven't said that we think all these practices should be banned, but we just raise these as real concerns and issues that we think need to be addressed in the context of the proceeding.
I think Paul wanted to, and then Mike.
Yes, thank you. If I may respectfully, slightly disagree with my friend Rick. I think there are a couple of things, first of all, that were left out of that. On the two edges right now, at least on one edge, it's widely accepted and assumed that you pay more for more use, right? So Amazon pays a whole lot more for connectivity than some very small online retailer. Google obviously pays a lot too. And that kind of a pay for what you use model, I think, is appropriate. On the other edge, the other end of the network, that is to say the 24/7 gamer in their home ought to pay more than grandma sending a few emails. It makes perfect sense. And so that I think is widely agreed. What I don't agree about is that there's not an incentive for investment if the core kinds of favoring the pay services are deployed in a way that's reasonable, at least in my view. The no harm approach that I have suggested is one in which would require that kind of investment, because if you really have a zero-sum game limited capacity network, you can't prioritize other services without deprioritizing other services. And so the only way you can get to the point of offering that kind of prioritization, those enhancements, is by investing in new capacity. And I think that's a great encouragement. And if there's a new business model for the network operators whereby they have to invest but can get paid for it, that works well for everybody, including those who are still on the best efforts network, because you'll be actually siphoning traffic off of the best networks, best effort network to go into these prioritized services.
Great. The link, and then more.
First, in my comments, I tried to be as helpful as I could in terms of providing what I think are some areas of consensus. But that said, I also started off by saying that if you look at the traffic on our network every day, there really isn't any evidence that there's a problem here that we need to have new net neutrality regulations applied to. And this is another example of this. The idea about two-sided pricing and about how those models will work, we don't even know, because that market's not even developed yet. There aren't examples of that very much that I know of. This market has not evolved yet. So that's one of the points we're making about these rules. We're trying to anticipate all the time potential areas that people think there may be problems in, and we don't even know that there will be problems. We do know over and over again that the internet has allowed innovation and new kinds of approaches to occur, in many cases because new business models developed, new ways these companies could interact with each other that were helpful. And this is another example. There could be a lot of examples here that are helpful in terms of providing enhancements to the feature sets that businesses have, for example, and content players have. We don't know what they are. So to anticipate again and try to impose rules is just a bad idea. Now, Rick said something else that I thought was interesting. He said that he was worrying about the debate in Europe. Well, one of the reasons that Europeans are debating this is because he began to debate it again actively. They have been dealing with a range of issues around broadband policy and largely have finished their policy discussions on this. And net neutrality was one of the issues that got raised. In my view, they actually didn't do too bad a job of dealing with these issues. And now they're starting to raise them again. Why? Because we're talking about them. But the point is that they weren't before, and now they are. And Rick's worried about it. Well, I think it's because we did that. Finally, and capacity. This one really floors me. Verizon, for example, in December of this year, did trials in Massachusetts, I think it was in Boston, with something called XGPON, or NGPON, some people call it. It's the next version of our Fios fiber to the home technology. And what were we trialing? Can we offer a gig to the home? So why are we trying that if we're trying to maintain or restrict capacity? Why is Comcast now advertising 100 meg service in this area? They haven't offered it yet, but they're advertising it. Why? Because we offer services that offer 50, and they know we can do more than that. So the idea that there's any possibility these companies want to restrain capacity is really fallacious. Network management is critical, and I would use wireless as the example. It's the best example, because it's a lot easier for people to understand. There are so many challenges with that cell phone when you're walking through a cell site, and how you have to change the power levels in that cell, and it's done by, in your phone, it's done by the cell site itself. It's done by the tower that we have, and it's done constantly. It's constantly communicating back and forth. There has to be network management for a lot of these things to work well. So, the reason I worry about regulation in this space is you just don't know how those are going to be interpreted, and over time there will be challenges, and no question people will want to redefine and refine these rules. And I just don't think it's a good idea. And David Clark was one of those who said that. He's not a supporter of everything broadband providers do, but he did say in his filing at the FCC that we've got to be very careful about imposing these kinds of rules, because network management increasingly in the network is going to be important.
Okay, can I just have the Morgan, and then Rick, you can respond.
I thought there were two interesting things as we talk about this. This already exists for the large players. It's called Akamai. I mean, it's interesting that Akamai isn't at the table when we're having a discussion about two-direction pricing, because the large players already use it. If you have Apple computers out there in the audience, when you get a push from Apple to send a system update, it's Akamai that they're using to make sure that it's efficient and covers some more ground. My small guys can't afford Akamai usually. So there's some real opportunities there for some of the larger telco players to provide quality of service improvements that aim directly at the little guys. I'll give you a good example. RingCentral is a virtual PBX company. All of you guys in your office right now, you have a box in the back. It was probably made by 3Com or Cisco, and it manages all your phone calls that come into your office. It knows that the office manager is at 018 and that your desk is 012. Well, they're saying there's no reason that can't be done virtually. And I could basically have my email stored. I could have all of my technology that provides this wrapped through my cell phone, and all my voicemail and all my communications intra-office can be done virtually. The problem that they have with this excellent service that's gotten great ratings is the quality of service. One reviewer said, it's wonderful technology with a great user interface. The only thing that sucks is I can't depend on my phone call. Now, RingCentral is exactly the kind of company that should be able to go to AT&T or Verizon and say, hey, we're looking to make a major push into New York. What will it cost us to get the quality of service assurance so that we can compete directly with Cisco, so that we can compete directly with the other companies that provide those big NBX boxes that sit in every office. So there are opportunities for small businesses to really monetize and offer new value on top of an existing network by paying a little extra to get a little more.
Rick, you may have the last word on
a couple
this.
quick thoughts. CDNs, it's a very different market, as Paul noted. It's a competitive market. It's one where you have lots of different providers out there. The issue when you talk about router-based differentiation by a network company, you can't duplicate that. Nobody can duplicate what you can do in the network in terms of that prioritization that happens there. That's the thing that we are concerned about. Europe doesn't have this issue quite the same way because they have unbundling. In many of the countries there, they actually have ISP open access. And in some places, actual structural separation, like in the UK. So I always call network neutrality kind of, it's almost the last resort you have. If you have no physical layer competition, no ISP layer competition, what you essentially have left is the need for some sort of non-discrimination principle. We have a duopoly at best in the United States. Is 2 enough? I don't know. I think that's an open question I think we can debate in the proceeding. We don't have any companies like Verizon restraining capacity now because they're not currently employing prioritization-based deals. If they were, I suggest most economists would believe that there's a shifting of incentives there. And I think, again, that's worth talking about in the proceeding. And finally, to go back to Paul's point, I think it's really interesting, this notion of
zero-sum game, or a concept that if there's something that happens in the network, that you're inherently discriminating against somebody else by prioritizing your own traffic. I think there have been some debates back and forth about whether anything that happens at the router level in fact matches that standard. And I think actually questions have been raised in the past year by ITIF, I think properly so, about really getting into what happens to particular packets in a network. Are there some cases where you can prioritize things at the router level that doesn't impede anybody else, that doesn't degrade others inherently in the neighborhood around you, for example? I think those are the really kind of great technical questions to really dive into, and hopefully Julie and his folks, his team, will be doing that in the coming months.
Okay. Rick? Richard? Sorry. Oh, sorry, Richard.
Yes. So this question about kind of the big assumption that the internet treats all traffic the same. There's a single service level. It's always worked that way. If we depart from that model, it's the end of the world. Okay, with your cell phone, you have voice minutes and you have a data plan. Voice is an application that requires low latency, high quality, that requires a particular quality of service. You pay for that, right? And that's a two-sided market. And in Europe, the way that's priced is that both the sender and the receiver of a call, pay for it. Or in the U.S., we do it that way. In Europe, it's only the originator that pays for it. And the data plan is priced completely differently. Now, and Rick says, well, there's no discrimination at the router level of the network. I beg to differ. On the mobile internet, which, by most analysis in 5 to 10 years is going to be extremely larger and more important than the fixed line internet is today or ever has been. The routers treat telephone voice packets differently than they treat data packets. And this has implications for business models that want to thrive in the mobile telephony space, like Google Voice, where there's this sort of open access considerations that are caused by the pumping charges in certain locations. So that needs to be unregulated because it's an advanced service. The networks are engineered to treat these things differently. And there are a lot of applications that are emerging, especially in the mobile network for video streaming and other kinds of really high volume applications, where the actual economic requirement for those applications to flourish is something that's a less than best effort service. Something like, I think, what the Kindle uses, where it delivers books over the wireless network to your device, and it's doing that without the subscriber having to have an account with the wireless network that does it. Amazon pays for it. Consumer pays Amazon for the service, and the network is actually delivering those book packets using free time that's left over after all the telephone calls are put through, after all the data plan packets are put through, when it would otherwise be idle. And so it's very low cost. So it's like a bulk mail type service. And so the amount of innovation that you can have on a network is kind of constrained by the abilities that the network has to deliver packets under certain conditions. And when that set of conditions is expanded, I think the universe of innovation in the application space grows larger. And that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. The richer the network is in terms of the services that it can offer at price points, the greater the universe of innovative applications becomes.
Great. I was going to ask folks about this difference between wireless and wireline, but I'm not going to do that because I want to leave some time out here. But I do want to add a commercial for Richard. We have a new report on wireless policy and technical issues that we'll be releasing, March 2nd?
Yeah, wait from today.
Wait from today. My God, you got to finish the edits here. So if you could raise your hand, wait for the mic, and identify yourself, Jonathan.
Yes, hello, my name is Jonathan Zuck. I'm with the Association for Competitive Technology. I think another question that gets raised by the NPRM is where we strike this balance between sort of very specific preemptive regulation and sort of principled enforcement after the fact. And so my question, I guess, somewhat unfairly is directed at Rick, because there's a lot of instances in which you've been confronted with a desire for preemptive specific regulation up front in terms of merger review, etc. Right now you're going through with one ad mob. There's a lot of people with arguments about what you might do, and therefore we might want to change the nature of those agreements, etc., because of what you might do, etc. When I suddenly discovered Buzz in my Gmail account, I may have wished that platform providers of email had specific regulations on them that prevented that kind of experimentation by you. So I guess the question is, once we set this precedent on the internet where we're saying we should preemptively and very specifically regulate rather than engage in principled enforcement, where does that stop? And I think that could end up having a very big effect on your business.
Well, I guess, this is kind of the age-old debate about certainty, right? We need certainty in the regulatory space in order to adopt business models and move forward and provide the services consumers want. So one way the Commission could do this is to simply say, we will have a case-by-case adjudication of any complaint anybody brings to us for any reason, period. End of story, see you later. Well, that creates maximum uncertainty, I would imagine. So there's an adjudication process that has this completely open-ended basis for doing anything. There's also, prescriptive regulations. Here's a set, let's add another 30, 40, 50 pages to the Code of Federal Regulations with great specificity. Here's what's going on. Every little thing here applies on a forward-going basis. We'll have to modify it every 6 months or a year because the technology markets are changing. I think that's not a good outcome either. And the Commission's trying to find something in the middle, right? Here are a set of rules, each basically one sentence long. Here's some guidance around what we think it means. But largely, let's leave it to the adjudication process after the fact, as markets and technologies change and as some problems crop up and other problems die off. And hopefully the Commission can be an agile adjudicator. You brought up some of the other instances involving Google. That's at the Federal Commission. They have a somewhat different way of looking at things. They're less in the regulatory rulemaking construct. They're much more about specific investigations and enforcement, et cetera. So the FCC certainly could move in that direction. It can shift its gears and become more of that kind of agency. It hasn't been to this point, but I think this process and this proceeding is an interesting place to have the conversation around, should the Commission start to really radically change the way it addresses things in the market and do it only when things pop up that appear to be causing problems for folks.
This is another example where, again, I think we were trying to come to some consensus in the joint filing we made, which I think Rick is still with us on this, but in that filing, one of the things we talked about with this technical advisory group, and one of the reasons we think that's so important is if you have that group with the standard we talked about, harms to users or competition, and it says or, not and. So we're not saying you have to go and prove that somebody did something in managing the network or offering a new enhanced service, for example, that did both, that harmed a lot of users and also hurt competition because they were acting anti-competitively. We said or. So you could have an example where somebody does something perfectly legitimate from their standpoint in managing their network, but it hurt a lot of consumers. That shouldn't be allowed. We agree with that. We think that's not the way to manage networks, to make everybody else suffer because you're trying to deal with one particular congestion problem. So the standard, I think, is important that we set out there. And secondly, this technical advisory group, we want to see it created outside of the FCC environment as a separate private body to talk to the FTC model that Rick mentioned. There are examples of the FTC where they do just that. They have self-governance bodies of industry and other players that look at an area like advertising, for example, and fairness in advertising, and that's models used. And the FTC still has oversight. They can, in fact, adjudicate issues if it becomes an issue that can't be resolved by the industry players. But we'd like to see that same model here because, again, it allows innovation, it allows people to try things out. And, in most cases, from what we've seen so far the last 10 years where we've had this policy, we've had a policy going back to 1999 where broadband companies can invest and are not constrained by the regulations that used to be common in the common carrier regulation of the old days of the telephone markets, where there was a monopoly, where there wasn't competition. And it's worked. We've had investment, and we've had an open networks, we've had experimentation, we've had a whole range of new applications that come about because of the investment in part. And our view is we had to let this continue. And we, in our filing, tried to suggest some ways to help provide mechanisms in this new environment to deal with some of the potential problems that people have raised, although we don't think they're likely to happen, but they do. We've got some structure we think will be useful. So when I was invited here today, what we wanted to focus on was, can we come to some consensus? And I tried to outline 4 or 5 areas that I think there's a fairly strong set of comments from a lot of players saying these are areas we think we agree on. And if we can move forward on some of those, I think it would help still get competition, still have choice and investment, but allow for a process in case there are problems that crop up.
Over right here and then here.
David Saradsky from the Federal Trade Commission. It's wonderful to hear everyone saying what a great job we do, and I'll accept that on behalf of the FTC. But of course, anything else I say, I have to caveat, as the people who work for government usually do, that it doesn't represent anyone's view but mine. The question about the rules up front versus rules in the back, or rules that are enforced afterwards, sort of depends on how clear your rules are going in. In the antitrust world, the FTC has 100 years worth of precedent that we are building on top of, and it sure helps companies to know, because there is all that precedent. And we still sometimes lose in court because the courts disagree with the way we've interpreted it in a new environment. So I guess I would ask about, in this area, the reason that the Comcast case is in the DC Circuit is because no one really even knows what the ground rules are. And so the question isn't whether to have ground rules, but how specific or detailed should they be, and what should they be? And on the question of what should they be, I guess I'd like to throw out the question that I didn't hear anyone talk about, which is the so-called non-discrimination principle. Assuming that we're not going to regulate pricing, what does non-discrimination mean? How do we figure out what that is, and what kind of general ground rules are we going to have so that we can figure out on a case-by-case basis whether anyone's violated it?
Just to be clear, you mean price discrimination as opposed to packet discrimination?
Well, I don't know if there's really a difference. I mean, if you are charging people the same but discriminating on the basis of packets, it's sort of the same as processing the same packets but discriminating on price. So I'm not sure you can differentiate between those two, but if I'm wrong,
I think you're still talking about price discrimination, because there's packet discrimination, which has nothing to do with prices. But so let's,
in terms of network management.
Yeah, network management. So why don't we focus on price discrimination?
I mean, I think that's actually, we haven't been using the word discrimination, but I think that's actually most of what we've been talking about is the anti-discrimination rule. And it's a difficult construct, because in network engineering, discrimination and differentiation are the same thing. I mean, that's how you raise the quality of service. So the voice call is that you discriminate positively in favor of the voice customer and the voice customer's packets against the data customer and the data customer's packets. And so it's discrimination in the legal sense is, this bad thing, except there's all kinds of constraints in history about how you identify harmful discrimination and disparate impact and disparate treatment and all, this whole sort of legacy of law in employment and housing. But then we take this notion of discrimination, which has these meanings in these other contexts, try to import it into network engineering, where technically it has a completely different heritage, has a completely different meaning, and is actually an enabler for good things to happen. What are we talking about? So Internet Standards has something called differentiated services, which is the standard way of discriminating among packets.
I'm not asking about charging different amounts for different things. I'm talking about charging different people different amounts based on business relationships. And really, the background is not race discrimination, it's common carriage law of non-discrimination. And maybe Link or Rick, you want to take a crack at it.
The standard under common carrier regulation has allowed you to offer different kinds of services to different players at different prices. It has a standard of unreasonable and unjust discrimination or differentiation. So you have been able to do that. The difference in the common carrier regime is that everything was so heavily regulated, you couldn't offer these services unless you got a tariff and you got the approval of the commission. And so there really wasn't an ability to really form a great market that way. And in those days, of course, it was a monopoly, so there wasn't a possibility in most cases anyway. What we have offered, this harms to users or competition standard, is what we think ought to be the standard rather than the non-discrimination principle the FCC has in its proposed rule. One of the reasons is I read the non-discrimination standard the FCC has as being even more stringent than the common carrier regulations that used to exist. So you even have a harder time figuring out, can you offer different kinds of services for different people? some people believe that, the term non-discrimination is wrong to me. It's differentiations in the markets. Can you offer different kinds of services to different people? It's not discrimination. That's how markets work, offering people something better that they want to pay more for, or offering a different quality of service. And that's good for the markets. It gives consumers more value. That's one of the problems I always saw in kind of a straight line idea of common carrier, that everybody ought to be given the same service. And there are things that people could get that would help them that you can't offer on the same basis to everybody, or at least it doesn't fit everybody, put it that way. So that was a problem with common carrier regulation. One of the reasons I'm worried about this whole discussion about should we go back to Title II was one of the discussions we hear, is that there may be a possibility that people think we had to go back to Title II regulation for broadband services. And although Rick seems to think you can differentiate and just say that it only covers network providers, if you look at the Supreme Court, I'm not a lawyer, but if you look at the Supreme Court decision back in the, I think it was the Brand X case, and I'll just read you what it said. It said, if you subject to mandatory common carrier regulation, all information service providers that use telecommunications as an input. What they were saying is they're integrated. Telecommunications and information services are integrated. So it is to the consumer, one service. But if you apply it to everybody, then basically it reaches everybody in the internet space, or could reach everybody in the internet space, I think. And that's a danger with this. It actually could go further than anybody would think they'd want it to. So beyond that, I don't think there's a need for it. I think we have a market that's working, and as I said, I think there are some things that we are proposing in the joint filing that would help create a structure that if there are any things that happen, we can deal with it going forward.
I guess I disagree with Link on the reading of Justice Thomas's decision in Brand X. He actually, and to be honest, if you go back further than that, under the dial-up world or the early world of DSL, there was never any hint that the FCC could regulate the internet, quote unquote. I mean, even before the internet, they were the small online companies, and the commission never got involved in their businesses. So to say to go back to that regime, not that we're saying that we should, that the commission should, but if you did go back to that regime, I think it actually in some ways it makes it easier to focus the regulatory attention just on the networks and not worry about the other sides. I do agree with Richard and Link, though, about this notion about differentiation. We always try to use that phrase as much as we can in our filings and our public statements. Differentiation is kind of the sum total of the universe of things that can happen in the network. Lots of things that happen there that are differentiation-based are fine. The things that we think are not fine are what we call discrimination. And maybe that helps in terms of the nomenclature here, or maybe it doesn't. And it does come back to the standard. The Title II standard is reasonable non-discrimination. And that would allow things like, treating like customers in certain ways. Also allows things like buy and return discounts, allows lots of other kind of leeway. And frankly, over time, the Commission's interpretation of that standard has gotten pretty loose. So what the Commission proposed, and many of us in the network side, and the network neutrality side of this, at least believe is the better way to go, is a simple non-discrimination standard. One that says you have to treat everybody more or less the same, but then a reasonableness standard for network management that you hook up to that. So you have kind of the standard, the straight standard and the reasonableness standard. The concern is if you have reasonableness in the standard itself and then in the network management, you've got two sets of reasonablenesses going on. And frankly, I think that allows too much leeway for some things to happen under the rubric of managing networks.
I want to keep moving on because I know people have questions, so why don't we go here?
I'm Tom Spavins, I'm from the FCC, and I just want to shift the discussion a slight bit. Link seemed to say that there was an emerging consensus, or aspects of an emerging consensus. Now, one of the things Verizon did to help us was they submitted some very substantial, thoughtful statements by two of the giants in our economics profession, Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker and Dennis Carlson, major figure and longtime friend of a number of us in the commission. I was wondering whether, and puzzled, on how you can reconcile your statements of where there's a consensus with their views on the proper role of government intervention and antitrust. Making my caveat, there's absolutely no reason why Verizon can't sponsor witnesses or experts for whom Verizon disagrees on. Because I see quite a bit of daylight between what they've written and say in this and other forums and what you've described as the consensus that Verizon is kind of in the general way associated.
How would
Could you help me on that?
how would you summarize what you think the difference is in the filing? Because I read it, but it's been a while. I didn't write it, obviously they did, so.
See, Dennis has written a number of papers where Dennis has made it his belief that as a matter of antitrust methodological principle, if what a carrier merely does is extract surplus and therefore damage a supplier or a customer, that should be excluded from the scope of antitrust laws and public policy. Dennis has also written in a famous paper with Mr. Picker of the University of Chicago a rather stark position that said in all interconnected industries, the interconnection regimes invariably fail and have to be replaced by end-to-end vertical integration. He also said, and I don't think Verizon would ever dare to say this, that any time you have a situation like this, the vertical integrated carriers will never stop fighting to achieve an end-to-end goal. And he has a nice example from the railroads. Dennis also published a paper in the Georgetown Law Review in which he said network decomposition between separate providers is inherently impossible.
Okay,
Now,
how did you try to respond to that?
I can't reconcile those views.
Well, I've never read any of the rest of the papers you're talking about, so it's hard for me to comment on any of that. The reason I'm saying there's a consensus, at least in some of these areas, and I'm not saying it's a consensus on everything, obviously, there's 4 or 5 areas that I mentioned that I think there's a fair number of filings to say this is a good idea or something we have to be looking at. Is not that I want to see regulation imposed. Obviously, we think, and I mentioned at the beginning, the markets are working well. Consumer companies should be able to, in a competitive market like this, be able to offer different kinds of services without regulation. But we also understand that there have been concerns raised, and we also understand there's a lot we could do as an industry better to make the internet work better. So the reason we proposed the technical advisory group and the idea of a standard of harms to users or competition or anti-competitive activity is because we want to encourage experimentation and try to focus on what we think a lot of these problems are, which are technical. Many of them are technological or technical in nature and not policy, or even in some cases business related. They're technical issues. Now, the Comcast example to me, I read a lot of it, so I don't know what actually all the facts are, but the ones I looked at, seems to me that they were taking action on what they thought was a severe network congestion problem. They did something that didn't work, and a lot of consumers were harmed, or at least they were blocked, in effect. And that shouldn't be the way you manage networks. And this kind of group could do a lot to provide a place to come and say, wait a minute, not just looking at issues on an ongoing basis, but companies can come in and actually say, look, I've got a problem here, I'm thinking about this. You guys have a lot of experts here who know this stuff. What do you think about this approach? Does this work or not? I think that can help immensely in dealing with a lot of these problems. That's what we're proposing.
Quick response.
Talk about a monopoly.
No, I'm collaborating. So here's just one example. I just want to put this out there, and because I think this actually nicely demonstrates the quandary here. So last spring, Sling Media introduces a mobile application. Lots of people out on their handsets and on their networks. AT&T refuses. AT&T will not allow it to be carried over their 3G network. So the reason they give is network management, and the particular rationale is that the protocol being used in this particular case by Sling Media was sort of a bandwidth hog. It soaked up too much capacity, and therefore it was problematic. Well, Sling did a little research and found out that, of course, its own application, while I think it used about 140 kilobits per second roughly. By contrast, there were 4 or 5 other very similar applications that were then carried on the AT&T network that used 3 to 4 times the capacity, 400 or 500 kilobits per second, let's just say. And Sling confronted AT&T and said, what about this? And AT&T just kept saying, no, network management. So this dragged on for 9 months. I mentioned this at a Free State Foundation panel a couple weeks back. 3 days or 4 days later, AT&T decided, we're going to now let you on the network. So I raised that not to say that what AT&T did was wrong, because frankly, we don't know, and that's the whole problem. AT&T could have been managing the network in a completely reasonable manner, totally rational, no doubt about it, and that's fine. But they also could have been blocking access to the network so they could put together their own service offering, or just because they didn't like Sling or was competing with something else on the AT&T network where they had a contractual relationship. The point is there's nobody there, there's no cop on the beat, in the phrase of the chairman, to determine what's going on. Now, a technical advisory group would be great. There is none today. Federal Trade Commission, I don't know that would rise to the level of actual investigation. It seems to me this is the kind of thing that requires somebody like the FCC to have a platform, a place for people to go to, whether it's a Sling Media or any consumer, and say, somebody's screwing around with my packets, I need somebody to figure out what's going on. So that, I think, is the issue about whether there needs to be some sort of regulatory hook by the commission in the broadband space.
Actually, I want to go back to Rick. Let me just add before I do that. There does seem to be a consensus here, which is in the sense of, I have no idea what that was all about, but let's just say it was about network management. Then clearly companies need to be able to manage the networks and not let applications on that would do harm to it. On the other hand, they shouldn't be allowed to discriminate just because they don't feel like it. So I think the consensus is that you can do reasonable network management, you need a process, and part of the debate here is about what that process is, exactly what that's going to look like. Rick?
Thanks. Hi, Rick Zimmerman with NCTA. I want to go back to the non-discrimination question and do it by way of giving a shout out to NARUC, which many of you know is the organization of the state public utility commissions. At their meetings here in DC last week, they adopted a resolution that on the one hand generally supported net neutrality and principles 1 through 4 and 6, but with respect to principle 5 as articulated by the chairman, which is the non-discrimination standard, they pushed back a little and said the appropriate standard would be one of no unreasonable discrimination. And so I praise them for that. They also suggested, by the way, that net neutrality rules, if they're adopted, should apply to application-based providers like Google, although they didn't specifically mention Google by name. But this question of reasonable network management being the only caveat to non-discrimination, that doesn't seem to be sufficient to me, because Rick, you yourself mentioned volume, term, pricing, things like that are allowed under Title II. It seems to me that there could be volume pricing, for example, if it's cost-based, that has nothing to do with network management, but ought to be allowable, but would not be allowable under non-discrimination. So I just want to explore a little further, and others can jump in as well, this distinction between unreasonable versus non-discrimination. It seems like tempering it with more than reasonable network management is necessary.
Yeah, I guess if you don't mind, I'll just jump in real fast.
Yeah.
I think the problem here, and I don't mean to monopolize the conversation, in some sense we're sort of trapped in these two buckets, right? We've got kind of the straightforward non-discrimination standard, the one that the commission used in some of the computer rules. It was part of the 96 Act. It's always the BTOP program passed by Congress, which NTIA adopted, basically say flat out no discrimination. And then you had the Title II standard. In a sense, I don't think we should necessarily get ourselves all caught up in which of those two is the right answer, because it may be neither one is the right answer. And it may be the thing to keep in mind is not trying to get ourselves hemmed into what is non-discrimination, but rather, as I've told somebody recently, the FCC, let's just call it FRED, right? The thing we want to preserve is FRED. And let's get rid of the baggage and focus on what are the practices that we think are acceptable and the things that are not acceptable, and the things that are sort of in the middle that maybe need to be dealt with separately in the adjudication process going forward. I think that may be a little easier way than always trying to get ourselves strung up in this the legacy of decades-old precedent, which goes different ways, cuts different directions, different time frames, have different results. That's a good thing.
So
We're running
I think
most of the time, so everybody can keep comments short.
I think the question is, and the FCC says this in their proceeding at the NPRM, they actually asked a question about the rules they're trying to design are to try to preserve openness. I think we already have it, and it's actually worked well for the last, as I said, decade with the policies we have. I don't think that's the issue, and that's what Rick is addressing to some extent. I think the issue more is that we have a lot of issues that the internet could handle better, technologies and services that could handle better, and we got to find ways to come up with new constructs to deal with some of these problems. And some of them can be handled by policies in the IETF and protocol changes and that kind of thing, but a lot of them have to be increasingly handled by companies managing their networks and coming up with new services. And that's why we like a group like we're proposing, because there's a place there we could bring some of these ideas and try them out. The issue that Rick mentioned about Slingbox, for example, I don't see why that kind of group couldn't be saying, well, let's take a look at what you're doing. And they could have a place to say, here's what we're doing, here's the problems we're facing, and why we're managing the network the way we are, and the constraints we're facing. And there's a place to do that. So part of the problem, and Tom talked to our executive vice president mentioned this a few weeks ago at a talk he gave, is that it's very difficult with the statutes we have today to try to figure out how to deal with these kinds of policies in the current environment. We have a different environment. We have competition. We have new networks. I mean, look, in this last Snowmageddon, if you look back in 1996, and I was here then, 1% of federal employees could telecommute because we had dial-up. That's it. We had no broadband at all. Today, most federal workers were saying they were able to operate, and many of them were saying, I have my BlackBerry too, and we didn't even have wireless networks then. So the policies have worked. They have encouraged investment. We've got a good open environment for using these technologies. If we have issues that we need to deal with, come up with a different framework. I think the old regulatory constructs are just hard to fit with today's environment.
Richard, quick.
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to almost agree with Rick on the notion of preserving FRED. And we can probably come up with we can define FRED as some acronym, and then we can go out and preserve FRED. And that'd be great. But it raises another just sort of odd feature of this debate, is that it's about preserving these historical qualities that the internet has. How often in technology do we worry about preserving technology or attributes of tech? I mean, isn't technology about creating the future? And it's just sort of an odd, I mean, and I think you need to sort of think about not keeping the internet the way it's always been, but what kind of a network do we want to have in the future? I mean, to me, that's a more important question.
I think what we want is free, reliable, energetic development.
There you go.
Question back here, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Chris Bone from Verizon. Someone mentioned earlier, and I can't remember, apologize whether it was Rick or Paul, that the Europeans did not implement strict network management rules because they had unbundling. I think that's really kind of like lib footnote to what was an 18-month process of revision of the European framework. In the context of the framework, we could debate whether or not unbundling has created adequate market conditions in Europe, or whether the lack of unbundling in the U.S. and platform competition has created adequate market results here. But in the context of the framework revision in Europe, Europe looked to whether or not there was anti-competitive activity occurring in the marketplace. And there wasn't. They looked to see whether or not there was something that they needed to address directly. They did beef up rules with regard to transparency, and they looked toward the existing connectivity principles at the FCC in the U.S. and decided that a restrained, much more conservative approach was warranted. We hear now that the Parliament and the Commission are asking themselves, well, what is it that we missed? And the only thing that's really happened since then in that dynamic has been the existence of an NPRM process here in the U.S. So I wonder if anybody has any sort of additional comment on the European process and what happened there.
It can't be you, Lynn. Paul, you want to, or Morgan, you want to?
Well, it's my turn to speak, I suppose. Look, I guess I would answer the question posed in the title of this seminar, no, if it's based on this panel alone. I hope that you don't walk away with the impression that the sort of the polarization of views on this panel is representative of what I think is actually out there. I think there is more consensus than was demonstrated today. As to Europe, just a quick footnote, which is that in the United States, at some level, this has been portrayed as a clash between industries. Network operators on one side, edge service providers on the other, both of whom are largely American firms in the U.S. In Europe, that single nationality doesn't exist. In fact, the network operators obviously are local, whereas the edge service providers are largely American firms. So if we get net neutrality wrong here, it's going to be a lot worse there. On some of the points of consensus here, it just seems to me we talked a lot about whether we should have ex ante rules versus ex post enforcement of sort of antitrust principles. At some level, I can agree philosophically that we might want to just abandon the FCC and get rid of. Sorry, I love you, Billy, but we do have an agency that is specialized in this area, and there are many hundreds of rules of regulations in much less important areas than this, and this is one deserving of clear rules for everyone's benefit. I firmly believe that there is an opportunity here for a win-win-win, where not only do consumers and edge service providers win,
by clear net neutrality protections, but also the network operators themselves would win by having clear rules for what they could do, what kinds of new business models they can engage in for pay. This is not for free, but for pay. If you talk to folks at Sandvine and Cisco, they're disappointed that they've not been able to sell as many DPI routers as they would like because of net neutrality debates. Well, let's get beyond this period of uncertainty and get to the certainty that I again believe that benefits everyone. Thanks.
Great. We're going to have to stop. I apologize for that. I promised the question, but maybe you can ask it after. Jules, do you want to make any last comments before I wrap it up?
He's in retirement unless it's finance.
You can go work for Amazon after this.
No, I just would emphasize, I think, Paul's point, even though there has been some debate and people tend to focus on differences, I think it's continued to be constructive. The dialogue that we've had today and ongoing is helping to draw people to a consensus. When we start to talk about what do you mean by terms such as differentiation versus discrimination, and you start to drill down, I think you start to find out that there's not as much difference as you really think.
Great. Well, a couple of things before we close. One is, I think that our next debate, next dialogue we're going to have, if we really want to debate, we'll have a debate where we have 3 FCC folks and 3 FTC folks. So we'll just let them talk it out as to who gets to have all control over this. Second point is, I just keep going back to the piece that Phil Weiser and I wrote 4 years ago, A Third Way on Net Neutrality, and I think in a lot of ways that stands up pretty well, and maybe people have come around to Phil and our point of view, but maybe not. And the last point is just to thank everybody here on the panel. I thought you all did a great job, and thank everybody in the audience for paying attention.